Well, all right. Good evening, everybody. So, obviously, we would like to be together tonight, but illness is keeping us apart, which is a bummer, but so appreciated Pastor Brandon's email today. Just that good reminder that the Lord is good, as the old hymn says, whatever my God ordains is right. We're going to take comfort that He has good intentions, He has good purposes, and He's going to use them to refine us, make us more like His Son Jesus, and cause us and force us to call on Him and trust in Him with all our hearts. And we're going to thank Him for the blessings of technology. Allow us to make videos like this and to teach you guys from a distance and encourage you to gather together in your homes and or out in public if if it works for you, and consider these things together as the body of Christ. So what I'm going to do with this video is really basically just give you a bonus lesson in our heaven study. So this wouldn't be a lesson I would have included in our original plan, but so you can think of it as a short bonus lesson. At least I think it's going to be short. And then I'll just give you a couple of discussion questions to consider either on your own or as a family, and maybe a couple recommendations for another video or two that you could track down on the Bible Project to keep discussing these things as a family if you are wanting to fill more time. So we're going to start this way. I want us to think about how you'd answer the question if someone asked you, what is God's goal for Earth? What would you say if somebody asked you, what is God's goal for Earth? And there might be a host of different answers, and that's if the question even makes sense to you. But despite all of these different kinds of answers we might hear, of course, as Christians, we want to think about what the Bible would say. What's the Christian idea of God's goal for Earth? Now, the Bible might answer this a few different ways, not essentially different answers, but use different language or different ideas to communicate the same thing. But one way that the Bible answers this question is this way, that God's goal for Earth is heaven on earth. That God actually has a plan to unite heaven and earth. We get this idea from a place like, well, the end of the story of the Bible, Revelation 21, as it pictures the end of time, as it pictures the last day. The image we get is here in 21, 1 through 3. It's one of the examples of the image that we get anyway. And I want you to notice here that the image we get is not of the earth going away forever. So we do get the image of the first earth, the earth that we're in right now, passing away. But we also get an image of heaven as it is now, passing away. And what we get instead of these is a new earth and a new heaven, right? Heaven and earth are reborn. They're resurrected with believers. The earth is made new. Heaven is made new. And in some mysterious fashion, they're united. Like in a marriage, they're made one, and that's where God makes His dwelling with us. So we see this with the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem, I think, is an image of the church or people of God. And we get that from the fact that this city is dressed as a bride adorned for her husband. That the this is another way of describing the bride of Christ coming down out of heaven from God. So this is the redeemed people of God, having been resurrected and renewed, and then they are brought together with this new earth, and in that new earth is where God makes that new earth and heaven is where God makes His dwelling place. That we will be made new, heaven and earth will be made new, and heaven and earth will be made one, and that is where God will live with us. So we have it here. God's goal for earth is to make it new and to bring heaven into it. So then the question is, well, how do we get to that point in the story? That's the end of the story. Well, how does this story start? Well, of course, it's obvious, isn't it? You've probably guessed it. That story starts all the way back in Genesis chapter 1. And the story was never going to be any different. This was always God's goal. And we see that from the very beginning. So, if you've paid much attention to me at all in the last couple of years, you know I'm very fond of pointing this one out here. This command here in Genesis 1:28, to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. It is absolutely crucially linked to this news in verse 27, that we are made in the image of God. Okay? So we're made in the image of God, and that means, right? That gives meaning to this command to be fruitful and multiply. Adam and Eve here are not being commanded simply to have a lot of babies. They're being told, rather, to fill the earth with the image and glory of God, right? Heaven on earth. We see the same thing with Noah, right? When Noah's told to be fruitful and multiply and increase greatly, it's immediately after he's reminded that man is made in the image of God. A little bit different language when you get to Abraham in Genesis, but it's basically the same idea, that God blesses those he calls, and they are made a blessing so that all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So again, the people of God, chosen, loved, called, like the nation of Israel, right, in Isaiah here. Your light, right, is referencing Israel's faith in God, right, the light of God, and the nations are going to come to that light. So again and again, the people of God, the chosen ones of God, the loved and blessed of God, are blessed in order to be a blessing, in order to be a blessing to the nations, in order to fill the earth with the glory of God and represent heaven on earth. Okay, so the question now is, okay, well, you say that this is the goal for the earth. We see that it was always the goal for the earth, but why haven't we got there yet? You're showing us where the story starts and you're showing us where it ends, but why is it taking so long to get to the end? Well, you know this too, right? The reason we're not there yet is because we sinned, right? We messed up. We didn't multiply the way we should have. We decided we would do things for our own glory. We wanted to act as if we could be in charge, not our good, generous, and loving Creator. So that's why the coming of Jesus in the New Testament is such a big, big deal. We failed, we fell, and we represented and lived for ourselves rather than God, but then Jesus comes. And he becomes this perfect representative, not only of heaven, but also this perfect representative of man, right? He's heaven's king, but he's come to earth to live and to die and to rise from the dead in our place. Now, Matthew tells this story in a really amazing way, and it's one of my favorite things to point out about the Gospel of Matthew. So I've got a little bit of a train of thought here, to bear with me a little bit. So, kids, if you're listening, you know what what a train is, right? You got these different cars, and those cars are linked together so that this big engine pulls those cars, and eventually, right, those cars are going to get pulled into the station, and you're going to arrive at your destination. The next couple of minutes here is going to be like that. I've got a few different train cars. I want to tie them together, and then if you hang with me, we'll get to our destination, and you'll see what the big overall point is, okay? All right. So Matthew's telling this amazing story about how Jesus is the fulfillment of all these plans of God to fill the earth with his glory, right? To make heaven on earth. And it all starts here in the very, very beginning of Matthew. We're told about Jesus Christ, right? And he is the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he is a man, right? He represents man. Not only that, but he represents all of the all of the hopes for mankind that were wrapped up in the people of God. They had hopes for mankind to be restored to the garden, right? Um, to be faithful to their calling, to represent heaven on earth. And we failed again and again to do that, but Jesus is showing up on the scene as we are introduced to his story in Matthew, maybe as the guy who's not going to fail. But we'll get to that in a minute. The next thing we see is that he's not only a perfect representative of man, right? But he is also a perfect representative of God in heaven. He is literally Emmanuel, God with us, right? Then there's this amazing thing, astounding thing that happens after we're introduced to Jesus, this God man. In chapter 2, we read that God's plans for the earth are starting to be fulfilled already, even in Jesus' infancy, as he sought and as he's worshipped as heaven's king. Okay, so we see that these wise men, right? And these are pagans. These are not Israelites. They don't necessarily have the scriptures. I mean, they may have had something, but they're foreigners. They're pagans. They're not under the rule of the Jews, Israel, and yet they are coming. These foreigners, the Old Testament phraseology would be the nations, right? The nations are paying attention, and they're coming to worship this new king. Okay, so we see it already happening, right? Matthew tells us that the nations are identifying this representative of heaven on earth, and they're wanting to worship him. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because the next thing that Matthew tells us about Jesus, after Jesus is identified as the representative of heaven on earth, right? What is the next thing that Jesus tells us about, or that Matthew tells us about Jesus? Well, I forgot to put it on the screen here, but in, let's see here. We'll do this, make it easier. In Matthew 2:15, we read that Jesus had some time in Egypt, right? Out of Egypt, I have called my son, the prophecy says. So right after Jesus is identified as the representative of heaven on earth, he spends some time in Egypt. He goes to Egypt. Now that might not seem like anything significant, but keep looking with me. After Jesus' time in Egypt, what's the next thing that Matthew tells us about Jesus? Well, in Matthew 3:13 through chapter 4, verse 2, we see two things. We see Matthew record two things after Jesus' time in Egypt. One, Jesus crosses through the waters, right? Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. He crosses through some waters, and then after crossing through those waters, right, immediately after, it says, then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, and it was for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay, so after he is identified as the representative of heaven on earth, he has his time in Egypt. And then the next thing Matthew records is Jesus crossing through these waters and entering into a period of temptation in the wilderness. Now, what does that sound like to you, right? A chosen servant of God, a special representative of God on earth, taken into exile in Egypt, and after his exile in Egypt, crosses through water into a long time of temptation. Well, that sounds like Israel, the nation, in Exodus, doesn't it? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. Now, of course, there's all kinds of differences. Jesus' temptation was 40 days, not 40 years, for example. But here's the difference Matthew wants us to see. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he stayed faithful. He didn't fall. He didn't sin like Israel did. And this is absolutely crucial to see in order to understand everything in Matthew that follows. Because this Jesus character is going to start doing some amazing things in the coming chapters. In chapters 5 through 7, he's going to start talking like he's in charge of everything. After that, in chapters 8 through 9, he's going to start acting like he's in charge of everything and doing things like healing the sick and the blind and the paralyzed. And he's going to command storms to stop. And he's going to cast out demons. And he's even going to raise the dead. And this all builds to the climax of the book where Jesus, having given himself up to death on a cross, stands before his disciples, resurrected, alive, and well. And he tells them this. In Matthew 28, 18 through 20, he says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always, to the end of the age." Matthew here tells us something amazing. Jesus himself, heaven's king, right? All authority. He's got it all as the resurrected one, as the perfect sacrifice for sinners, as the perfect man, as the image of God, crucified and risen for sinners. All authority is his. It's his. It can't be taken away. Nobody's crawling up to heaven and taking him off of his throne. And here's the amazing thing. Heaven's king now shares that authority to represent heaven on earth with us, with his disciples. He commissions them to go, right, and live in all the world, telling people about the true King of heaven and how God has fulfilled all his purposes for the world by sending Jesus to die for our sins and bringing us under his gracious and loving rule. So, if you have time with your family tonight, or even just on your own, you can think or talk about these questions tonight. First, how should my life be changed by the news that Jesus is king? Right? And he's got all authority in heaven and on earth. How should my life look different? Now, not only that, maybe you're already a believer. You know you believe in Jesus and you trust Jesus and you really celebrate this news that Jesus has died for your sin and he is going to make a new world. He's going to make a new heaven and a new earth where we'll live with him in joy and peace forever and ever. Maybe the question for you then is, how should my evangelism be changed? Because Jesus is king and has all authority in heaven and on earth. Maybe sometimes you're afraid, right? You're afraid to tell people that Jesus is king. You forget what it says right here, right? That all authority is his. And in all of his authority, he's with us in order for us to go, right, and make disciples. He's not going to leave you. He's not going to abandon you. He's going to give you everything you need to be sharing the good news about his rule and his reign and his love, his death, his resurrection, and his grace with others. If you want to explore this theme even more, check your email. There's a message there from me with a link to an additional video from the Bible Project on this theme of the gospel of heaven's kingdom. And that will provide even more good news to discuss and think about. Also, it's a lot prettier than this video. If you want to explore the website, The Bible Project, on your own, just head on over to Let's see here. I'll make a new one here. It would be Bible. It's pretty easy. BibleProject.com. Lots of really cool videos. 5 minutes, 8 minutes max. Great for family discussion. We watch one at least once or twice a week, and use that to help the kids learn how to read and understand the Bible. So I hope this has been kind of fun. Maybe something to get the discussion going around around the table, around the living room, as we're apart tonight. And Lord willing, we'll be back together next week. God bless.